Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer. If you're currently preparing for your BALB exams, specifically for international trade law, you're going to want to grab a notepad right now. We are looking at the 1958 GATT panel report on Italian discrimination against imported agricultural machinery. It's a high-density case, but it's an absolute masterclass in treaty interpretation, the national treatment principle, and that supercritical line between legal border protection and illegal internal discrimination. We are going to dissect every single detail you need to know to ace this topic. To make sure you really master the mechanics of this for your exam, we're breaking it all down using the FIRAC framework. We'll start with the facts of the dispute, move into the Article 3 inconsistency claims, look at the panel's legal interpretation, examine Italy's subsidies defense, check out the impairment of UK benefits, and finally, wrap up with the final panel recommendation. So, starting with Part 1, the facts of the dispute, which completely center around Italian Law No. 949. The whole thing kicked off back in 1952. The Italian Ministry of Agriculture set up this massive revolving fund with a 25 billion lira a year budget to kickstart their post-war agriculture. Now, the super important detail here is that 7.5 billion lira of that was carved out exclusively for farmers who were buying Italian-made machinery. And because it was a revolving fund, the interest and repayments on those loans went right back into the pot to fund even more loans, keeping the program running all the way until 1964. If you qualified, you got a loan covering 75% of the tractor's cost, spread over 5 years at a highly subsidized 3% interest rate. And here's where you really see the staggering material inequality. Let's say you're an Italian farmer. You buy an Italian tractor, boom, you get that 3% interest rate. But if you wanted to buy an imported British tractor, well, you were slammed with commercial rates hovering right around 10%. Now, Italy tried to argue that regular banks offered competitive rates, but come on, there was absolutely no denying that a state-backed 3% rate was essentially a VIP pass designed exclusively to encourage buying domestic. All right, moving to Part 2, the legal clash over GATT Article 3, Paragraph 4. Okay, look closely at this treaty language. You literally need to memorize this for your exam, specifically the phrase affecting their internal sale. This is the very bedrock of the national treatment principle under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. The rule is simple. Once a product crosses the border and clears customs, it has to be treated exactly the same as a domestically produced good. So the UK came in and argued that by denying these sweet credit facilities to purchasers of imported tractors, Italy was flat out failing to accord treatment no less favorable. The UK basically said, look, this exclusive credit facility is blatant discrimination and illegal protectionism. But Italy pushed back. They countered that the General Agreement only covered regulations directly governing the actual conditions of sale. Italy's defense was essentially saying, hey, Law 949 is just a macroeconomic development law to boost post-war employment and farming. It's not a trade regulation. They argued that Article 3's scope was strictly limited to regulations that dictate the literal mechanics of buying and selling, not peripheral stuff like consumer credit facilities. Which brings us to Part 3, the panel's legal interpretation and treaty exegesis. This right here is where your exam answers are really going to shine. The panel actually had to resolve a translation discrepancy. The French text, which Italy approved, read as a negative obligation, translating to shall not be subjected to less favorable treatment. But the panel decided to rely on the English text, which mandates positive equality, shall be accorded treatment no less favorable. This is a huge distinction. It means that if you proactively give a bonus to a domestic product, you must actively give that exact same bonus to the import. Indirect protectionism, totally shut down. The panel basically said it was entirely irrelevant that Law 949 didn't specifically spell out direct conditions of sale. And then the panel legally defined the word affecting to mean anything that might modify the conditions of competition. This completely dismantled Italy's narrow interpretation. This is a massive, massive precedent in international trade law. You see, the drafters explicitly chose the word affecting instead of governing. By offering 3% loans only for domestic tractors, Italy was drastically modifying the competitive landscape on the internal market. They were heavily incentivizing farmers to bypass imported British machinery. Let's head into Part 4, subsidies and Italy's economic defenses. The panel dismantled Italy's subsidy defense with some pretty flawless logic. Okay, yes, under Article 3, Paragraph 8b, Italy is totally allowed to subsidize its producers, but Law 949 didn't hand money to tractor manufacturers. Instead, it gave specialized credit to the purchasers, the farmers themselves. The logic here is simple but crucial. You cannot grant a subsidy to a consumer that is conditioned on them buying domestic, because doing that instantly distorts the market against imports. The panel also made the logical point that if Article 3 didn't cover these kinds of financial
financial advantages in the first place, the paragraph 8b exception wouldn't even need to exist.
Now, Italy didn't back down easily. They aggressively defended their domestic policy. They pointed to major budget constraints, arguing that if they were forced to offer those 3% loans for imported tractors, they'd have to vastly increase that 7.5 billion lire appropriation. For a post-war economy, they argued that was just impossible. Plus, they made the political argument that Italian tax revenues absolutely shouldn't be used to advantage foreign manufacturers in Britain. They argued the law was strictly needed to assure national production and employment.
But the panel wasn't having it. Their rebuttal is a crucial point for you to fully understand. The panel completely rejected the budget argument, stating that applying the credit to imports requires absolutely no budget increase whatsoever. It just requires a different application of the existing 7.5 billion lire. The government didn't need to add a single lire. They just had to let farmers use the existing funds regardless of which tractor they chose. And as for the whole taxpayer money argument, the panel insightfully pointed out that the financial benefit was actually going to Italian farmers, not foreign producers. So Italian citizens remained the primary beneficiaries of their own tax dollars anyway.
Moving along to Part 5, Impairment of UK Benefits and Market Realities. The panel dug into some extensive market statistics, and the contrast they found was stark. Total tractor imports from the UK were pretty stable from 1952 until about 1955. But then there was a sharp, significant falling off in 1956 and 1957. On the flip side, Italian domestic production shot through the roof. It more than doubled, jumping from 12,000 units in 1952 up to a massive 25,000 units per year between 1955 and 1957. This boom was heavily driven by post-war reconstruction and, of course, those incredibly favorable loan conditions. Italy, naturally, tried to minimize the impact of the law. They pointed out that only 44,000 tractors, which was roughly half of their domestic sales, actually utilized the credit facility. They blamed the drop in UK imports on general market saturation. Basically, they argued that since the other half of Italian tractors were sold on normal commercial terms and were still competing successfully with imports, the credit facilities weren't the real problem. They claimed their domestic industry was just doing a better job adapting to Italian agricultural needs. However, the panel firmly pushed back on that. They concluded that the 3% loans undeniably influenced buyer behavior and skewed the market against British tractors. Here's a golden rule for international trade law. You do not always have to prove that a discriminatory measure is the single, 100% sole cause of trade impairment. The panel logically noted that offering a 3% loan versus a 10% loan is, without a doubt, going to sway a small farmer's purchasing decision. Even if market saturation was a factor, the discriminatory credit terms inherently modified the conditions of competition. It probably influenced purchasers, and that was enough to constitute a violation. Finally, let's wrap up with Part 6, the final panel recommendation. The panel officially recommended that the contracting parties urge Italy to amend Law 949 to completely remove the discrimination against imported machinery. Acting under Article 23, Paragraph 2, they suggested drawing Italy's attention to the adverse effects and giving them a reasonable time to eliminate them. Notice that they didn't dictate exactly how Italy had to fix it. They just said Italy needed to modify the operation of the law or find other appropriate means to ensure that the discriminatory distinction between domestic and imported tractors for consumer loans vanished entirely. Now, pay very close attention, because this right here is arguably the most critical takeaway for your exam. If Italy actually wanted to protect its domestic tractor industry, they already had a fully legal GATT-bound tool to do so, a 32% tariff rate. Back in 1949, before Law 949 even existed, import duties on these specific wheeled tractors up to 7,000 cc were bound under the GATT at 40% ad valorem, meaning in proportion to the estimated value. Then, during the 1956 tariff negotiations, Italy reduced this to 32%. The panel made it explicitly clear that the GATT does not prohibit a country from protecting its domestic industry. Not at all. It simply dictates how that protection must be applied. And that leads us to the ultimate legal takeaway: permissible protectionism versus illegal discrimination. Protectionism must be executed transparently at the border through tariffs. It can never be done through discriminatory internal financial regulations post-customs that distort competition. The ultimate lesson of the 1958 agricultural machinery case is that once an imported product pays that 32% tariff and crosses the border, it is an absolute equal in the internal marketplace. Any internal credit scheme, tax break, or regulation treating it less favorably than a domestic product is a direct violation of international trade law. Keep this firmly in your mind for your exams because it is the very foundation of the national treatment principle. But it really makes you wonder, considering how sophisticated global trade is now, how often do modern states still try to cleverly blur this exact same line today?